The Italians and Americans are both known for being speed freaks when it comes to the cars that they build. But these cars couldn't be more different. The Italians were all about carefully sculpted, handcrafted coachwork and high-strung engines that ran like sewing machines, while the Americans are best known for big horsepower and big torque in lower maintenance and lower cost packages. A classic case of the sledgehammer versus the scalpel. But back in the 60s and 70s, there were a handful of people who combined American brawn with Italian styling to create some of the greatest cars of the era. Yet so few people know about these fledgling automakers. Everyone has heard of brands like Di Tommaso, but smaller marques have faded into obscurity. And one of those forgotten brands would end up being the ones that created one of the most beautiful cars that you've never heard of. Marrying American V8 power with gorgeous Italian styling, this car was the ultra-rare Intermeccanica Italia. And this is its story. Now, Intermeccanica has a very interesting story for how they first got into the car business. It was actually started by two Canadians of all things, Frank and Paula Reisner. This relatively young couple, as the story goes, fell in love with the Italian countryside and uprooted their life and moved there. In this process, they started Intermeccanica, which was a performance parts company that serviced Renaults and Peugeots in 1959. Sales started to come in, and Frank began to diversify and expand his business interests beyond just performance parts, to eventually work on race cars and set up what he believed would be his own coach-building empire. In just a few short years, Frank had made tremendous strides within his company, which would eventually intertwine his story with another automaker whom we have covered before on the channel, International Motor Cars. Around 1961, Frank Reisner met Milt Brown, who was a California native looking to bring his own Italian-bodied, American-powered sports car to life. He just needed a place to build him the custom bodies for his car. This chance meeting would spawn a pivotal deal for Intermeccanica, which would change their trajectory forever. Frank and his team were now charged with helping build and assemble the Apollo GT, which was a beautiful grand tourer powered by the aluminum Buick 215 cubic inch. Sadly, International Motor Cars, as a company itself, would end up going out of business after building just under 100 cars. With the Apollo GT officially being off the market by 1964, this left an opening to replace it with a new Italian-American hybrid. After all, Di Tommaso hadn't even built the Mangusta to yet at this time, let alone the Pantera. And thankfully, though, as the story progressed, by 1965, Reisner and had their hands set on their newest vehicle that they would be working on. But things got a little hazy at this point with what this next car even was. See, this story arc starts with Jack Griffith, who was a TVR dealer and legend in the TVR space, who was no stranger to stuffing American VEs into foreign cars, as he had done with the TVR Griffith. He worked with to bring a new V8-powered Grand Touring car to the U.S. market as his new business venture, and what is sort of a spiritual successor to the TVR Griffith. This new car was designed by Robert Cumberford and Franco Scaglione. It would be introduced as the Griffith 600 and also the Griffith GT. This glorious design was very heavily inspired by Ferraris of the day, particularly the 250 and 250 GTO, which is very evident when looking at the cars side by side. The long swooping nose, the short tail, and overall proportions were very similar between the cars, which certainly wasn't a problem because of how good they both looked. Powering the Griffith initially was a 289 small block Ford, which was the obvious engine choice for Robert Griffith, having used Ford V8s in the TVR Griffith. However, funding dried up for this project, and only a handful were built before another taker thought that this chassis and bodywork would be too good to let go to waste. Thus entered the Omega, which was the next iteration of the initial design, though it really was the same core care, except this time it was spearheaded by Steve Wilder, who had Holman Moody help build these cars. Around 30 of the Omegas would be built before the project, yet to gain fizzled out, leaving Frank, and to now have to sell them cars themselves. Frank would now rename the car again, this time as the Torino, and sell it as his own car in 1967, with the main difference now being that it was offered as a convertible and a coupe. While the prior two iterations were only available as coupes, and everybody still loved this beautiful body style of the Torino for Ford. See, Ford had the Torino name in their arsenal, and they made change this name for its final iteration because, well, Ford would have sued them into oblivion. So the car was then once again renamed to its final name, the Italia. Now, I know that was a complicated bit of backstory, but we're finally up to speed now, and we can dive into the underpinnings of the car. Underneath the Italia was a custom-designed chassis designed by John Crosswood, who previously worked with Lotus, BRM, and a handful of other brands in an engineering capacity. This square tube frame chassis was designed to support a parts bin, Mustang live axle in the rear with some reworked suspension geometry, as well as an unequal length wishbone setup in the front with four-wheel disc brakes standard. The Italia had daringly solid chassis to back up its looks. Sure, it wasn't nearly as advanced as the ones of other cars of the period, but with an asking price of just $6,000, it was nearly less than half the cost of a Ferrari under the hood. The Italia started life with the same 4289 base as the other versions, the Omega and the Torino. However, in this case, it would have been the 289 Hypo, which made 270 horsepower. However, this engine was shortly phased out by Ford and replaced with a 3.2 small block in the middle of its production run, which was a bit less high-strung and less exciting. Still, though, the 302 was a decent power plant for the Italia, which weighed only about 3,000 pounds even with its hand-formed steel body. And for the final hurrah of the Italia, the engine was once again upgraded to another Ford mill, this time being the 351 Cleveland, which made over 300 horsepower and gave the Italia the best performance numbers yet for 1969 and on. Primarily backed by a Ford T10 four-speed manual transmission, the Intermeccanica Italia really did provide arguably the best Italian-American crossover experience. The car was absolutely gorgeous, and more importantly than that, you could beat the absolute crap out of it and not have to worry about needing a specialized technician to replace parts that were super expensive. The Ford running gear made it a very attractive proposition for somebody who wanted the Italian looks and prestige without all the hassle. Besides just great performance, the interior was a great place to spend your time as well, sitting in one of the nicely upholstered bucket seats that were separated by a classy center console. The cabin was intensely driver-focused, and for the price point, it was fantastic. This interior looked miles better than any Corvettes did. And from 1967 to 1972, in 2002, Intermeccanica actually saw some really decent commercial success selling their final version of the Italia, making just about 400 cars, of which the convertible version was considerably more popular than the coupe. Although not a superseller by any means, the Italia would be considered a moderate commercial success. That helped Frank and the team at Intermeccanica build another car in conjunction with General Motors called the Indra afterwards. Now, the Indra was a whole other can of worms, and if you want to hear more about that car specifically, then drop a comment down below and we will do a separate video on it. Because the Indra not only was Intermeccanica's next car, it was also the end of their coach building as we know it. The company fell into some harder times, and things got changed around a lot along the way. And then eventually the company progressed into building replica Porsche 356 Speedsters, among all things. But their days of bespoke custom performance cars of their own design had finally ended. Intermeccanica's cars today are sought after by collectors, and while they don't trade hands very often, generally speaking, according to Bring a Trailer, they're worth between $80,000 and $200,000, depending on the model and condition. But those numbers beg a question. Will the youth of today and the next generation hold an appreciation for these cars, being such a unique manufacturer that isn't well known, or will they fade into absolute obscurity? I don't know the answer to that question, but I sure do hope the love for these cars does carry on throughout the next 50 years. Thank you all for watching another episode of our Rare Cars documentary series. If you enjoyed this video, we would greatly appreciate it if you could drop a like and also share this video with other enthusiasts. Also, please make sure that you are subscribed to the YouTube channel and smash that notification bell for more documentary-style videos just like this on the world's most interesting cars. Until next time, enthusiasts.